I came home for lunch on a Tuesday, 6 months pregnant, craving a sandwich I never got to eat, and instead I opened my own bedroom door and found the man I was going to marry tangled up in our sheets with his coworker. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I just closed the door as quietly as I'd opened it, the way you'd close a door on a sleeping child, and I walked back down the hallway of the apartment we'd built 2,000 miles from everyone I loved. That was the moment my whole life cracked down the middle. I just didn't know yet that 18 years later, the daughter I was carrying that afternoon would stand in my kitchen and tell me to get over it. I remember the strangest details from that hallway. The way the afternoon light came through the cheap blinds and striped the carpet gold. The smell of the coffee I'd made him that morning, still faint in the air. A pair of her shoes, not mine, hers, kicked off by the front door, and I remember staring at them and thinking, in this calm, faraway voice, so that's whose those are. My body knew before my mind would let itself catch up. My hands were steady. My breathing was even. It's a thing that happens to you in the worst moments, I've learned, since you go somewhere quiet inside yourself, somewhere the pain can't reach you yet, and you function. I functioned all the way out the door. Let me go back, because you can't understand the ending without the beginning. My name doesn't matter much in this story. I was the girl who fell in love too young and too hard. I was 18 years old and pregnant, and the father was my high school sweetheart, a boy I'll call Derek. He was charming in that effortless way that should have been a warning sign instead of a green light. When he asked me to move across the country with him, I said yes before he'd even finished the sentence. I packed up my whole teenage life into cardboard boxes, kissed my mother goodbye at an airport gate, and flew toward a future I was absolutely certain about. We were going to be a family. I had a ring on my finger and a baby on the way and a head full of plans. My mother had stood at that first gate, the one I left from, not the one I'd come crawling back through, and she'd held my face in both her hands and told me to call her every Sunday no matter what. I remember thinking she was being dramatic. I remember being a little embarrassed by how tightly she held on. I was 18 and certain that love was a thing you could engineer with sheer will, that if you wanted something badly enough and gave it everything, it had no choice but to work out. Nobody tells you at 18 that you can do everything right and still get destroyed. Nobody tells you that wanting it isn't a strategy. I boarded that plane believing I was the exception to every cautionary tale my mother had ever tried to tell me. We lived together for a year in that little apartment with the thin walls and the radiator that clanked all night. I worked, cooked. I picked out names for the baby and folded tiny onesies and pictured Derek holding her. He was 25 to my 18, 7 years older, which everyone back home had quietly raised an eyebrow at, and which I had defended like it was a virtue. He's mature, I'd tell them. He takes care of me. He was, it turned out, taking care of someone else too. The gorgeous coworker. The one whose face I would later recognize in the background of his weekend party photos, smiling, drink in hand, while I was 1,200 miles away and 4 sizes bigger and crying myself to sleep. The apartment had a way of feeling smaller the bigger I got. I'd waddle from the kitchen to the couch and the walls seemed to lean in. Derek worked odd hours, or said he did, and I spent a lot of those evenings alone, one hand resting on my belly, feeling the little flutters that would become Maya, talking to her in the dark before she had a name I'd settled on. I told her about her grandmother. I told her about the ocean I'd grown up near and how I'd take her there someday. I built her a whole world out of words in that quiet apartment, and the whole time, the foundation under us was already rotten, and I was the only one who didn't know it. When I think back on that girl, talking to her unborn daughter in the dark, I want to reach through time and hold her. I want to tell her to run sooner. But she wouldn't have listened. She loved too hard to listen. When I walked out of that apartment, I didn't take much. I took my work bag. I took $200 out of our shared bank account. Money I'd earned anyway, and I left everything else behind. The furniture, the dishes, the framed photos, the ring. I left it all sitting there like the set of a play that had been canceled mid-performance. I got on a plane with swollen ankles and a broken heart and I flew home to my parents. And when my mother saw me come through the arrivals gate, she didn't ask a single question. She just opened her arms. I cried for the first time in that hug. Not in the apartment. Not on the plane. In my mother's arms. In an airport. 6 months pregnant and back where I started. The flight home is a blur of held breath. I sat by the window with my forehead against the cold plastic and watched the country I'd been so sure about slide away beneath the clouds. A flight attendant asked if I was all right, and I said yes, of course, the automatic yes, the one women are trained to give before they've even checked. A baby cried 3 rows back the entire flight, and I remember thinking, with this hollow ache, that soon that would be me, that I'd be doing this alone, that the family I'd flown out to build had collapsed before it ever stood up. I didn't let a single tear fall the whole way. I think some part of me knew that if I started in that pressurized cabin, surrounded by strangers, I might never be able to stop. I was saving it. I was saving all of it for the only arms I trusted. And those arms didn't let go for a long time. My mother held me right there in the terminal while travelers streamed around us, and she just kept smoothing my hair like she used to when I was small and feverish. She didn't say, "I told you so." She never once, in all the years that followed, said, "I told you so." That restraint is its own kind of love, and I didn't appreciate the size of it until I had a daughter of my own and learned how badly you sometimes want to say it. My father took my bags without a word and carried them to the car, and on the drive home nobody made me explain anything. They let me sit in the back seat and stare out the window at the streets I'd grown up on, and they let the silence do the work that words couldn't. My parents took me in without hesitation, and they became the foundation everything else got built on. My daughter, I'll call her Maya, was born 3 months later, in the dead of winter, with a full head of dark hair and a cry that could shatter glass. She was perfect. She was mine. And I made a decision in that hospital room, holding her against my chest, that I was going to give her a life so full of love she'd never feel the hole her father left. I started college 6 months after she was born. I was gone 12 hours a day between classes and work and the commute, and during those hours my parents weren't grandparents, they were her parents. They fed her and rocked her and walked the floors with her. But the second I came home, I took over completely. I dropped my bag by the door and scoop her up and just breathe her in. She was my reason for everything. I lived for her. I breathed for her. She was my whole world before she could even say my name. Those college years nearly broke me, and I'd do every single one of them again. I'd study in the car in parking lots between classes and shifts because there was no other time. I'd fall asleep over textbooks at the kitchen table at 1 in the morning, and my mother would find me there and drape a blanket over my shoulders and turn off the light. I memorized vocabulary lists while pushing a stroller around the block to get Maya to sleep. I wrote a midterm essay on 3 hours of rest with a teething baby on my hip, typing one-handed. There were nights I sat on the bathroom floor and asked myself who I thought I was. A single teenage mother trying to claw her way into a profession, and every time, I'd hear her cry down the hall, and I'd remember exactly who I was. I was her mother. That was the only credential I cared about, and it was the one that got me through everything else. And Derek? Derek was a ghost. During that entire year, he was MIA, missing in action, missing in every way that mattered. I'd see his social media when I couldn't help myself, scrolling at 2 in the morning while I rocked a colicky newborn, and there he'd be, 25 and gloriously free, partying every single weekend. And so often, in the corner of those photos, there she was, the coworker, still around, still smiling, while I was at home, exhausted, working myself back into my own body because the gym was the only place I could pour all that grief and rage. That's how I coped. I worked out like a woman possessed. Every mile on the treadmill was a mile away from the version of me that had trusted him. I was rebuilding more than my body. I was rebuilding a person. The gym became a kind of church for me. I'd go at 5 in the morning before the sun came up, before Maya woke, while my mother listened for her cries. The place would be nearly empty, just the hum of the lights and the squeak of my shoes, and I'd run until my lungs burned and the noise in my head finally went quiet. I wasn't trying to be beautiful for anyone. I was trying to remember that my body was mine, that it belonged to me and not to the verdict a man had passed on it in our bedroom that Tuesday. With every pound of weight I lifted, I was lifting myself out of the version of my life where I was something somebody could discard. I'd come home soaked in sweat and pick up my daughter and feel, for the first time in months, like a person who might actually survive this. The grief never fully left, but I learned to carry it, and the carrying made me strong in ways I'm not sure I'd have chosen but wouldn't now give back. He flew in for the delivery. I'll give him that. He was there in the hospital, looking shell-shocked and out of place, holding his daughter like she might break. And 3 months later, he announced he was moving to our state to co-parent. I was naive enough to think that meant diapers and pediatrician appointments. What it actually meant, I figured out fast, was that Derek wanted to get back into a relationship with me. He'd circle around with that old charm, dropping hints, lingering too long at drop-offs. But by then something in me had hardened into something better than bitterness. It had hardened into clarity. I was done. I had a degree to finish and a daughter to raise, and I was not going to set myself on fire again to keep that man warm. I remember the exact moment I knew the charm had stopped working on me. He'd shown up at my parents' door one evening with takeout, uninvited, all easy smiles, and he leaned against the frame the same way he used to lean in high school, like the world was something that happened around him while he stayed comfortable at the center of it. And I looked at him and I felt nothing. Not anger, not longing, not even the old pull. Just a flat, clean nothing. The way you feel about a stranger's car alarm going off down the street. He kept talking and I kept watching his mouth move and I realized I was free. Not because I'd won anything, but because I'd finally stopped wanting the thing that had cost me so much. He left that night with his takeout going cold on the porch and I went back inside to my daughter, and I slept better than I had in a year. For years past, I finished school. I met the man who would become my husband. I'll call him Mark. A steady, kind, unglamorous man who showed up and showed up, which after Derek felt like a miracle. And around that same time, Derek met his own long-term girlfriend, a woman I'll call Vanessa. And here's the strange thing, when Derek met Vanessa, he suddenly remembered he was a father. The man who'd given up on the whole enterprise of parenthood started asking for more time with Maya. More weekends. More school events. And you know what I did? I was happy for him. I genuinely was. I wanted Maya to have a father in her life. I wanted her to have everything. So when he started showing up, started trying, I made a decision that I thought was generous and right and good. He owed over $15,000 in back child support. $15,000 I had every legal right to collect. And I signed it away. I forgave the entire debt, because I told myself a father trying was worth more than a check. Mark was the opposite of everything Derek had taught me to expect from a man. He didn't dazzle. He didn't make grand declarations or sweep me off any feet. What he did was show up early to help my father move a couch and stay late to wash the dishes without being asked. What he did was learn how Maya took her cereal and remember it the next time. The first time I watched him kneel down to her toddler height to listen to some long, breathless story about her day, listening like it was the most important briefing he'd ever receive, I felt something in my chest unclench that I hadn't known was clenched. I'd spent so long bracing for the next betrayal that I'd forgotten men could just be good. Just be steady. Just be there. Mark was there. He's still there. And whatever else this story takes from me, it doesn't get to take that. I want you to remember that I did that. I want you to remember that I forgave $15,000 to a man who had abandoned me pregnant, because of what happened next. A month after I forgave that debt, my youngest brother died. I'll call him Danny. He was the baby of our family, the one who made everyone laugh, and his death took the floor out from under all of us. I was a wreck. I was grieving so hard I could barely function, moving through my days like I was underwater. And Derek saw that. He watched me at my most broken, my most distracted, my most vulnerable, and he saw an opening. While I was at work, drowning in grief, he filed to sue me for full custody of our daughter. He didn't tell me. He just did it. And then he took my fourth grader from my home without a word to me. Danny was 23. He had this laugh that filled whole rooms, the kind that made strangers in restaurants turn around and smile without knowing why. He used to call me his favorite sister even though I was his only sister, just to watch me roll my eyes. He adored Maya. He'd toss her in the air until she shrieked and my mother would scold them both, and he'd do it one more time anyway. When the phone rang with the news, the world I'd so carefully rebuilt brick by brick over 9 years simply stopped making sense.
Ide surviva Derek.
I'd survived single motherhood and college and poverty and shame. And none of it had prepared me for the particular cruelty of losing the brother who'd made all of it bearable. I was hollowed out. I was a shell walking around in the shape of a person. And precisely that, was the moment Derek chose to strike. I found out the way every parent's nightmare begins. I came home and she wasn't there. Called and called. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone. I tracked her phone because thank God I had that, and the little dot on the map showed her at Derek's house. My 9-year-old. Taken. And the cruelest part, the part that still makes my stomach clench, is that I couldn't go get her. We didn't have a formal custody agreement yet. It had always just been informal, cooperative, because I trusted him, and so legally, if I'd driven to his house and taken my own daughter back, I could have been the one in trouble. So I sat in my house, in the silence where her laughter should have been, grieving one family member while another was being ripped away from me. What would you have done in that situation? Sat on your hands like the lawyers told you to, or driven straight to that door? Let me know in the comments, because I have never once stopped second-guessing the choice I made. I called a lawyer that same night, sobbing into the phone in a voice I didn't recognize as my own. She was kind, but she was firm, and what she told me was the hardest thing anyone had ever asked of me. She said, "Do not go to that house." She said if I showed up and there was any kind of scene, any accusation, it could be twisted and used against me when the case got in front of a judge, and that the surest way to lose Maya for real was to do the thing every cell in my body was screaming at me to do. So I stayed. I sat at my kitchen table all night with the lights off, staring at that little dot on the map, watching it not move, knowing my daughter was sleeping in a strange bed under the roof of a man who'd stolen her. And I did nothing because doing nothing was the only thing that might bring her home for good. I have never in my life had to fight an instinct that hard. Mark sat with me. He didn't try to fix it. He just stayed up the whole night so I wouldn't be alone with it. A week later, Derek enrolled her in a school 30 miles away from the district she'd attended her entire life. The school where all her friends were, where her teachers knew her, where she'd been since kindergarten. He pulled her out of everything she knew and dropped her into a building full of strangers, 30 miles from home, like she was a piece of furniture he could just relocate. But that same day, that exact same day, my emergency court order came through. I will never forget driving to that unfamiliar school, walking into that front office, and being legally allowed to take my daughter back. The look on her face when she saw me, relief and confusion all tangled together. She was 9. She didn't understand any of it. She just knew her mom had come for her. The drive to that school is burned into me forever. 30 miles of unfamiliar highway, my knuckles white on the wheel, the emergency order printed and shaking on the passenger seat beside me like it was a living thing. I rehearsed what I'd say to the front office 100 times. I was terrified they'd refuse me, that there'd be some clause, some technicality, that Derek would somehow have gotten there first. But the woman at the desk read the order, nodded, and went to get my daughter, and the next thing I knew Maya was coming around the corner in a hallway that didn't know her, and she saw me and her whole small body changed. Her shoulders dropped. Her face crumpled and brightened at the same time. She ran, and I knelt down on the linoleum of that strange school and caught her, and I breathed her in the way I had every single day of her life since the hospital, and I whispered into her hair that I had her, that I would always come for her, that she never had to wonder about that again. I drove her home and she fell asleep in the back seat before we hit the highway, exhausted by a week of being a pawn she was too young to understand. Then came the war. And it was a war. 2 years of it. 2 years of attorneys and filings and court dates and the kind of stress that ages you from the inside. By the time it was over, I had spent over $18,000 in legal fees. A third of my entire yearly salary, gone, just to fight for the right to raise my own child. $18,000 and an ocean of emotional distress. Not just for me but for Maya, who was being pulled back and forth between 2 homes and 2 stories about who the bad guy was. And here's something you should understand about how the money worked, because it tells you everything about who Derek is. He never faced a single financial hardship through any of this. Not one. Because Derek has never, in his entire adult life, held a real job. His mother paid his attorney fees. His girlfriend Vanessa was the breadwinner for the whole length of their relationship. Derek spent his days at home playing video games, occasionally, when he felt like it, picking up a shift on Uber Eats or DoorDash for spending money. That's it. That was the man fighting me for full custody. A man who contributed nothing, paid for nothing, and was bankrolled by the women in his life so he could play the doting father in a courtroom while I bled money I didn't have. I learned the language of that war the way you learn a foreign tongue when you're dropped in a country with no choice. Motions. Continuances.
Guardians ad litem.
Discovery. I learned to keep a binder, an actual 3-ring binder, of every text message, every missed exchange, every doctor's appointment I'd taken her to alone. I learned to dread the sight of a certain manila envelope in the mailbox because it always meant another filing, another date, another few $100s I'd have to find somewhere. I'd sit across conference tables from lawyers charging by the quarter hour, watching the meter run on my daughter's childhood. And I'd think about how Derek was at home on a couch with a controller in his hands while his mother's checkbook did his fighting for him. The injustice of it could have eaten me alive if I'd let it. Some nights it nearly did. But every morning there was a kid who needed her lunch packed and her hair braided, and so every morning I got up and packed it and braided it and kept going. After 2 years, I was exhausted in a way that went all the way to the bone. And I made a decision that I believed, with my whole heart, was the loving thing to do. I decided to leave the custody arrangement up to Maya herself. She was old enough to have a voice, I reasoned, and I never wanted her to feel like a possession being fought over. I wanted her to feel like a person with agency. So I asked her what she wanted, and she said 50-50. Equal time with both of us. And I agreed. What I didn't understand, what I couldn't let myself see because I always wanted to think the best of people, always gave Derek the benefit of the doubt I should have stopped extending years ago, was that there was no such thing as her own decision anymore. He was always in her ear, always shaping the story, always quietly, relentlessly manipulating a child who just wanted both her parents to love her. I thought I was giving her freedom. I was actually handing her over to a man who'd spent years learning exactly which strings to pull. If you're enjoying this story so far, take a second to hit that subscribe button. We post new stories like this every single day, and you won't want to miss where this one ends, because it gets worse before it gets clearer. The 50-50 arrangement held, on paper, for years. But I watched my daughter change in front of me. Slowly, the way you watch a tide come in. You don't notice each individual inch, you just look up one day and the whole beach is underwater. The longer she spent in Derek's house, the more I started seeing his worst qualities surface in her like a developing photograph. The selfishness, the casual cruelty toward people who loved her, the total inability to consider anyone's feelings but her own. This was not the little girl I'd raised. The little girl I'd raised had a dozen friends and played every sport her school offered and lit up every room she walked into. She was warm. She was kind. She was mine. And year by year, that warmth got colder. I could mark the change in small, specific ways, the kind only a mother notices. The way she stopped saying thank you to my parents, her grandparents, the people who'd raised her as much as I had, and started talking to them like they were staff. The way she'd roll her eyes when Mark asked about her day. Mark, who had never been anything but gentle with her. The way she began keeping score in conversations, looking for the angle, the advantage, instead of just being a kid who loved you back. I'd pick her up from a week at Derek's, and it was like collecting a slightly different person each time. A person who'd been subtly recalibrated, her edges filed into something sharper and harder. And I'd spend my week trying to soften her back, to remind her who she'd been, and just as I'd start to get glimpses of my real daughter again, it would be Friday and she'd go back and the work would come undone. By the time Maya was 16, the change was undeniable. At Derek's house, there were no rules at all.
No curfew.
No questions asked. She could come and go whenever she pleased, do whatever she wanted, with no one ever sitting her down to ask where she'd been or who she'd been with. Derek didn't parent, he just provided a building with no walls. And so, of course, my house felt like a prison by comparison. My house had a curfew. My house had chores. My house had a mother who actually cared where her teenage daughter was at midnight. And that became the fault line that everything else cracked along. You can't compete with a house that has no rules. That's the thing no one warns you about. I was offering her structure, boundaries, the unglamorous architecture of a real childhood, the stuff that doesn't feel like love when you're 16 but is the deepest love there is. And across town, her father was offering her a blank check on her own behavior, total freedom dressed up as trust, and to a teenager that looks like paradise. He got to be the fun one. He got to be the cool house, the easy house, the house where nobody asked hard questions. And I got to be the warden, the nag, the one who said no. I knew, even as I held the line, that I was losing a popularity contest I'd never agreed to enter. But I also knew that one of us had to actually raise her, and it was never going to be him. The prom incident is when I knew something had broken that might not be fixable. Maya had a boyfriend at 16, and she'd been blowing off her responsibilities at my house for weeks. Specifically, she'd flat out stopped cleaning her room, no matter how many times I asked. So I did what parents do. I told her that if she couldn't keep up her basic chores, she couldn't go to prom. A consequence. A normal, reasonable, boring parental consequence. And do you know what she did? She left my house to go to her dad's, the way she always did when she didn't get her way, and she didn't come back. But it's what she said while she was gone that nearly destroyed me. She told the people around her, her friends, her father, anyone who'd listen, that she felt uncomfortable and unsafe in my home. She didn't feel safe. Those were the words. My daughter said she didn't feel safe in the home where I had rocked her to sleep, where I had stayed up through every fever, where I had given up my own youth so she could have a whole one. She didn't understand the weight of what she was saying. She didn't comprehend that "I don't feel safe" is a nuclear word. A word that ends people. A word that should never be used as a weapon over a prom ticket and a messy bedroom. But it had been planted in her, and she fired it, and it went straight through me. She went to prom, by the way. Of course she did. I sat in her empty room the night she left, after she'd gone, and I looked at the mess that had started the whole thing. The clothes on the floor, the cups on the dresser, the ordinary debris of a teenage life, and I felt the ground tilt under me. Because I understood, sitting there, that this was never really about a clean room. The room was the pretext. The room was the stage. The real production was the story being written about me in another house 30 miles away, the story in which I was dangerous, in which my home was a place a child needed protection from. I'd given that girl every safe night she'd ever had. I'd been the one constant, the one fixed point, the one who'd never once left. And she'd taken the safest place she'd ever known and called it the opposite, because someone had taught her that words were weapons and that I was the target. I cried that night the way I hadn't cried since the airport. Mark found me on the floor of her room and just sat down beside me on the carpet and put his arm around me and didn't say a word. After that, I watched the girl I loved become someone I didn't recognize at all. She was beautiful. She'd grown into a stunning young woman, and she learned to use it. Boys gravitated toward her, and she'd pull them in and use them and discard them the second she was done, telling them she didn't want a relationship after she'd already taken whatever she wanted from them. She did the exact same thing with her friendships. The moment a friend stopped being useful to her, stopped serving her in some way, she'd cut them loose without a second thought. She cheated on the boyfriend, the one I wouldn't let her go to prom for, and that relationship ended too. The girl who'd once had a dozen loyal friends and a spot on every team now had, essentially, no one. She'd burned through them all. And every time I tried to talk to her about it, to reach the daughter I knew was still in there somewhere, I hit the wall Derek had built. Self-centered. Defensive. Convinced that everyone else was the problem. The loneliest part was watching the friends fall away one by one, because I remembered every single one of them from when they were small. I remembered the sleepovers in our living room, the pillow forts, the birthday parties where 8 little girls in party hats had crowded around our kitchen table. I'd watched those friendships grow from the time the girls were in pigtails, and now I was watching them die, and I knew exactly why they were dying, and I couldn't say a thing without being accused of attacking her. Mothers of her old friends would catch my eye in the grocery store, and there'd be this sad, knowing softness in their faces, this unspoken what happened to her, and I never had an answer I could give, because the answer was a man and a decade of patient poison, and there's no quick way to say that in a checkout line. Which brings me to this year, her senior year, her graduation. And here's the thing you have to understand about me. Despite everything, despite the prom, despite she didn't feel safe, despite the coldness and the cruelty and the years of being painted as the villain in my own daughter's story, I still loved her with everything I had. So when graduation started coming into view, I threw myself into planning a party. Not a little backyard barbecue. A grand celebration. The kind of party that says to your child, without words, "You are loved, you are celebrated. You matter to me more than anything on this earth." I was going to spend thousands of dollars I'd worked hard for, gladly, because that's what you do for your kid. I started picking venues. I started imagining her face. After everything, I just wanted to give her one perfect day. I had a whole vision for it. I'd lie awake at night not in anguish for once, but in something almost like hope, sketching it out in my head. String lights, a long table with all her favorite foods, a photo display. I'd already started pulling pictures, the baby with the head of dark hair, the toddler in the inflatable pool, the kid in the soccer uniform with the gap-toothed grin, the whole archive of a childhood I'd fought tooth and nail to protect. I thought maybe, just maybe, if I made the day big enough and warm enough and full enough of evidence that she'd been loved every single day of her life, some part of the real Maya might surface and look around and remember. I wasn't trying to buy her back. I was trying to remind her. A mother never really stops hoping that the child she raised is still in there, and I had a venue list and a budget and a heart full of that exact hope. And then, a few weeks ago, the whole thing detonated. Maya had a massive fight with her father. A 6-hour back-and-forth, drag-it-all-out screaming match, the kind of fight that leaves you raw. And in the aftermath of it, hurt and shaken, she did something she hadn't done in years. She came to me, she called me, and she confided in me, told me the whole ugly play-by-play of the argument, all 6 hours of it. And for a moment, one beautiful, aching moment, I had my daughter back. She trusted me. She needed me. And then she asked me to promise something. "Don't tell Dad any of this. Keep my secret." And I promised. Of course I promised. I would have promised her anything. I told her I don't even speak to her father, which was the truth, and I meant it with every fiber of my being. Her secret was safe with me. I held that phone call like it was made of glass. Her voice on the other end was younger than it had sounded in years. The defenses were down, the sharp edges gone, and underneath it all was just my girl, hurting and reaching for her mom. I sat on the edge of my bed in the dark and I listened to every minute of it, and I said all the things I'd been waiting years to be allowed to say. That I was here, that I was always here, that whatever happened between her and her father, my door never closed and never would. I could hear her breathing slow down as we talked, could hear her settling, the way she used to settle as a baby against my chest. When we hung up, I sat there for a long time just holding the warmth of it, daring to believe a door had cracked open. I should have known. I should have known that the warmer the moment, the harder the fall he had planned. The next day, my phone rang, and it was Maya, and her voice was ice. She accused me of telling her father everything she'd confided in me. Everything. The whole 6-hour argument, repeated back to her, supposedly straight from my mouth to his. I was stunned. "Maya, I didn't speak to your father," I said. "I haven't spoken to him in ages. I would never break a promise to you." But she'd already decided. She said Derek had told her directly that I had called him and told him all of it. And no matter what I said, she would not, could not believe me over him. I was so desperate to prove the truth that I screen-recorded my entire call log and sent it to her. Hours of calls, days of calls, and not one of them to Derek. Proof. Cold, hard, digital proof. And do you know what she said? She said I must have deleted his number from the log. There was no piece of evidence on earth that could compete with whatever her father had told her. He had made himself the truth and made me the liar, and he'd done it so thoroughly that my own daughter looked at a screen recording of reality and chose the lie. I have replayed that phone call 1,000 times, looking for the seam, the place where it might have gone differently. Her voice had gone from the warm girl of the night before to something I barely recognized in the span of a single day. Flat and cold and certain, reciting her father's version of events like a script she'd been handed. I kept saying her name. I kept saying, "Maya, think about it, why would I do that, what could I possibly gain, I love you, I would never." And every reasonable thing I offered just bounced off her like she'd been inoculated against it in advance. That's the thing about a really good lie told by a really practiced liar. It doesn't just plant a falsehood, it pre-arms the listener against the truth, so that every piece of real evidence you produce just looks like part of the cover-up. The screen recording should have ended it. Instead it became, in her father's framing, proof of how far I'd go to deceive her. I have never felt so powerless. Holding the truth in my hands and watching it count for nothing. I sat with that for a long time, trying to understand it because I genuinely wanted to believe there was a misunderstanding. Maybe Derek had misheard something. Maybe there were crossed wires somewhere. I'm the kind of person who reaches for the innocent explanation even when I shouldn't. So I did something that cost me a lot of pride. I called Derek directly. The man I'd sworn never to speak to. I called him to try to clear it up, to untangle the lie for our daughter's sake. It rang once and went to voicemail, sent straight there. So then I called Vanessa, his girlfriend, hoping she might be a voice of reason. Hers did the exact same thing, one ring straight to voicemail. Both of them, forwarding my calls in real time, deliberately, while presumably sitting right next to each other. I pictured them in that moment, and maybe I'm wrong, but I don't think I am. Sitting together on that same couch where he'd spent so many years doing nothing, watching my name light up the screen and pressing decline, passing the phone between them, almost laughing about it. The thing that got me wasn't even the lie anymore. It was the choreography of it. The way the two of them moved in sync to make sure I could never reach a single living soul who might let me correct the record. A misunderstanding doesn't dodge your calls. A misunderstanding picks up and says, "What are you talking about? I never said that." Only a deliberate plan sends you straight to voicemail twice in the same minute. The innocent explanation I'd been clinging to evaporated right there with that second single ring, and what was left underneath it was a cold, hard, ugly clarity. And that was all the information I needed. The two of them, dodging my calls the very moment I tried to address the lie, told me everything words never could have. It confirmed every suspicion I'd been too kind to fully voice. This had been engineered. He had manufactured a lie out of thin air, told my daughter I'd betrayed her trust, and then made himself unreachable so the lie could never be corrected. So I blocked them both. Right then. 2 taps. And the man who'd spent 18 years finding new ways to poison my life was gone from my phone. I am still, to this day, baffled by it. By the sheer audacity of it. How does a person look at the relationship between their own child and her mother and decide to set it on fire? Over a lie, a complete fabrication, a conversation I had never had, just to score a point. What kind of person does that to their own daughter, knowing she's the one who gets burned? Because that's the part that keeps me up at night, if I'm honest. Not what he did to me. I've made a kind of grim peace with what he's willing to do to me. It's what he was willing to do to her. He took the one moment in years where his daughter had reached out to her mother for comfort, the one fragile thread of connection between us, and he didn't just cut it, he weaponized it. He turned her own vulnerability into the very thing he used to push her further away from me. She trusted him with that lie. She believed him over a recording of reality. And he knew he had to know that the person who'd carry the wound of all of it longest wasn't going to be me. It was going to be her years from now, when she finally understood what was done and by whom. He burned his own daughter to win a fight she didn't even know she was a piece in. I will never understand a person who can do that. I stopped trying to. And then came the final blow. The one that brought me here, exhausted and heartbroken and genuinely unsure what's right. Maya called and told me her terms for the graduation party. She would only have the party I'd been planning for months, the party I was going to pour thousands of dollars into, if I involved her father. If he was there, after the lie, after the manipulation, after the calls forwarded to voicemail. She wanted me to stand in a room I paid for and smile next to the man who had just convinced her I was a liar. I told her the truth. I told her that after everything he'd just done, I would never speak to that man again, and that I was not going to spend thousands of my own dollars to host a beautiful celebration with him standing in the middle of it like an honored guest. Not after all of it. Not after the affair, the abandonment, the abduction of a 4th grader, the $18,000, the manipulation, the she didn't feel safe. And now this. There are so many things he's done that I haven't even had the time to lay out here. A whole catalog of cruelties stretching across 18 years. She didn't budge an inch. She told me it wasn't about me, that this was her graduation, her day, and she wasn't going to have 2 separate parties to accommodate my feelings. She told me to just get over it. Get over it. As if 18 years of sacrifice and betrayal and fighting for her were a mood I could simply shrug off. As if the man who'd orchestrated all of it deserved a seat of honor at the celebration of everything I'd built almost entirely alone. She spoke to me with this casual, cutting disrespect that's become her default setting, never once stopping to consider how any of it landed on me, never once asking herself what I might be feeling. And the worst part, the part one can barely admit out loud, is that somewhere in that conversation, the joy drained out of the whole thing. I didn't even want to throw the party anymore. The dream of giving her that perfect day curdled into something painful. And yet, at the very same time, it breaks my heart into pieces, because she's still my daughter, still the baby I held in that winter hospital room, still my whole world even when she treats me like an inconvenience. I thought about the photo display I'd been assembling, all those pictures of a little girl who adored me, sitting in a folder on my computer, and I felt something close in my chest. The phrase "get over it" kept echoing. It's a phrase you use for a stubbed toe, a bad day, a parking ticket, not for the entire architecture of a life laid down brick by brick on her behalf. And I understood, listening to her say it, that she genuinely did not know what she was asking me to get over, because the person who'd written the history in her head had carefully edited himself into the hero and me into the obstacle. She wasn't being cruel from nowhere. She was being cruel from a place that had been built for her, room by room, year by year, by a man who'd had 18 years and unlimited access to do it. Knowing that didn't make it hurt less, but it did stop me from hating her for it. You can't hate someone for believing a map they were handed before they were old enough to read it themselves. So that's where I am. Caught between a love that won't quit and a self-respect I've spent 18 years rebuilding from the wreckage Derek left in that apartment. If I host the party with him there, I betray myself. I reward the man who spent nearly 2 decades hurting me, and I teach my daughter that manipulation works, that lies win, that her mother's pain is something to be steamrolled. If I refuse, I might lose her completely. I might become, permanently, the villain in the story Derek has been writing in her head since she was 9 years old. Drop a comment below. Do you think I'm making the right call by refusing? Or am I about to lose my daughter over a stand she'll never understand? Because I genuinely cannot tell anymore, and I have never needed to be right less and needed to be wise more than I do right now. I've talked it over with Mark until there are no words left to say. He won't push me one way or the other. He says it has to be mine to decide because it's my heart on the line and my history with that man. And he's right, though some nights I wish he'd just tell me what to do. I've talked it over with my mother, who held me at that airport gate all those years ago and has held me through every storm since. And even she, the wisest person I know, doesn't have a clean answer. Because there isn't one. That's what I've finally accepted. There is no version of this where I walk away whole. Either I bend my self-respect or I risk my daughter, and both of those cost more than I have. Anyone who tells you there's an obvious right answer here has never stood where I'm standing, with the baby they raised on one side of the scale and everything they fought to become on the other. Here's what I keep coming back to, in the quiet hours after she hangs up on me. I gave that girl everything. I gave up my teenage years, my 20s, $18,000, $15,000 more in forgiven debt, my pride, my peace. I forgave a man who never earned it, for her sake. I let her choose her own custody because I never wanted her to feel owned. And the painful, complicated truth is that love, real love, doesn't always get rewarded, and being a good parent doesn't guarantee a good outcome, because there was always a second voice in her ear, undoing me. Maybe the most loving thing I can do now isn't to win her back by surrendering. Maybe it's to hold the line, gently without slamming any doors, and trust that someday when she's older and the fog clears and she starts asking her own questions about who really showed up for her, she'll remember which parent forgave the debt, which parent fought for 2 years, which parent came to that strange school 30 miles away the very same day. Maybe she'll remember who was telling the truth about a phone call. I have to believe she will. Because if I've learned anything across these 18 years, it's that you cannot light yourself on fire to keep someone warm. Not even your own child. And the hardest love of all is the kind that loves enough to stop burning. And so I keep the porch light on the way my mother kept hers on for me. I don't slam the door and I don't beg at it either. I just leave it unlocked and I keep the photo folder right where it is, and I go on being the parent I've always been even when there's no audience for it and no reward in it and no thank you at the end of the day. Because that's what showing up actually means. It means doing it when it's easy and doing it when it costs you everything, and never letting anyone, not even the daughter you die for, convince you that the love you gave was a debt she gets to dismiss. One day she may walk back through that door. One day she may not. But she will never, as long as she lives, be able to say her mother wasn't there. And in the end, when all the lies have worn thin and the truth is the only thing left standing, that may be the only inheritance that was ever really mine to give. Guys, we are inching toward 1,000 subscribers on this channel. If you are not subscribed, please consider hitting subscribe. It really helps us hit that 1,000 milestone. Thanks for sticking around.